Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Sir Cypher here with oh man, sorry, I'm so out of it from this being locked up in quarantine for the past week or two. Wargame Red Dragon. It's been a while since the last video. Sorry, things have been a little stressful in real life, but you know, better late than never. So this game was played, I think, a week or two ago. And it is the battle for San Aurula between Chinese Marines on the Red For side and the PL, People's Liberation Army, Navy, Marine Force, I think they're called. Bit of a mouthful. And then over here we have American Airborne and American Marines. So it's a 2v1, which it's debatable who has the advantage in a 2v1 because the player on the one side is going to get twice as many units. They're going to get twice as much money as any individual player on the BlueFor side. But since these are specialized decks, the Americans, the coalition side here, gets access to two different deck lists worth of units. They get access to the airborne deck list and the marine deck list. And while they have twice as much money and twice as much availability, over here, Frangible Cover only has access to the Chinese Marines deck list, which is more limited. Also, there's only one of him, and there's two of them, so they get they have twice as many two brains working to move their units around. So this map is the larger version of there's a 1v1 map called I think Hell in a Very Small Place. That's just this region here. But D-Day in Paradise is the whole region. So looks like we have a relatively heavy air opener with lots of Blackhawks full of, I can't tell what they're full of, but full of presumably either Marines or light infantry. We have a longbow, which although it's recon is like sort of the best American anti-air chopper or anti-tank chopper. And then we have these M60 DAPs, which are anti-air choppers. Now, I don't recommend grouping helicopters together like this. I don't recommend actually grouping any vehicles together at all, but I especially don't recommend grouping helicopters together like this because anti-air missiles have an HE value and they have splash damage. So if a missile hits a group of helicopters and they're grouped together, it'll shoot them all down at once, which obviously is going to put a dampener on your plans. We have Marines here in amphibious vehicles. One trick here also that Ace Buckeye is doing is if you have helicopters, you want to place them on an obstacle when it starts because then they'll start the game flying, which means they can start moving faster. Whereas if they start on the ground, which means they have to take off and gain momentum. And with helicopters, every second counts. Here we have on the Chinese side a more traditional opener of lots of infantry fighting vehicles with autocannons, presumably full of Chinese Marines, backed up with some crappy, tanks and stuff and some light AA. Now, as was in that battle for the airfield, the key thing for using a helicopter-based start, you can see here that these, they got to take off, and it really you lose a couple seconds, which can be a really big deal. You really have to do something aggressive if you're going to do a helicopter opening, especially if you're going to do a helicopter opening with lots of helicopter defense because, to cover it. So you really probably want to take like Golf maybe. You could race all the way across and take India, try and drop up here in the woods and Echo and block off the area. You need to have some area that you think you can seize before they have a chance to. So we have a fighter bomber here, looking for stuff to snipe at. Not really going to be super effective against helicopters, but maybe it could shoot 1 or 2 down. Looks like the frangible covering is Chinese. They're mostly going over the mountains. So if you're fighting in jungles and towns, that favors decks that have cheaper units, because it really becomes sort of attrition based, because more expensive powerful units are good against like long sight lines, and in things like jungles and forests they kind of become less effective. So doing an airdrop here, these troops are racing across here. Looks like it's just a small holding force here. So it looks like their plan is to take this town, cut the map in half, and back cap. The only problem is that these IFVs can help fight, and the Hueys can't really. But not a terrible start. The only problem is that these landing craft, unless I'm terribly mistaken, yeah. So a big thing in Wargame Red Dragon is units with wheels tend to have a 150 kilometers per hour ground speed, but they tend to have a lower off-road speed. Not always though. Whereas units with tracks tend to only have maybe a 100 or a 110 kilometer speed. So these, even though they weren't in helicopters, these fast Chinese wheeled vehicles were able to essentially match these Marines in getting to this area. So these guys are here fighting it out. So you can see here these IFVs they're not wheeled, so they took a little bit longer to get here. But now the problem is that while BlueFor got here first, it's not really clear that these troops are going to be able to hold off all this stuff. What you really need in a situation like this is napalm. I see some napalm here, but if you are playing a more technologically advanced rapid force, really your friend is napalm, because napalm will not stop helicopters, but it'll stop wheeled vehicles. So basically, you napalm this road coming up to here, you napalm this road, you napalm these roads, and then by the time their troops make it through the napalm, you're all established, you've got all your ATGM set up, you're all ready to go. So one problem is these U.S. Marines are still in their landing vehicles. They haven't hopped out yet, so they're gonna probably get killed inside their vehicles instead of fighting. When they could really be useful out of them. Yeah, and again I'm seeing, you'll notice that beyond some stuff like these really cheap tanks, the Red 4 players having his troops come into 1s and 2s, whereas this is like, this is like 100 points of ATGMs that aren't really required. Still though, these light infantry are doing a pretty good job. Light infantry are American combination close combat and ATGM infantry. They have really bad ATGMs, but it doesn't really matter. They have really bad missiles, but it doesn't really matter because they're fighting against really bad stuff. The problem is now they are exposed. And they really need some sort of air support or something coming up to relieve them. So we have the Chinese forces just kind of infiltrating here. And one of the things you can do is if your units are cheaper than theirs, especially if you have fast wheeled vehicles or fast tracked vehicles, you just start sending units down random roads and seeing how far they can get, because, you know, if they run into an expensive helicopter or like the chaparral or something else, then they'll be able to take it out. So right now, there's a bit of a stalemate. The problem is, though, is that Red 4 is very clearly winning, sort of like the attrition game. And unless something changes, they're going to just be able to keep dismounting cheap infantry and pushing them out. So yeah, like in any place where they're in the open, they can't get through because the Americans have access to a large variety of like long-range missiles that can take out vehicles. So, you know, these roads, this road, they're having trouble getting through. But the problem is, though, is that these kind of cheap, much cheaper Chinese forces can catch them in these enclosed areas and just grind them down. And really the only way you stop that is you have your own cheap forces to kind of meet them, you meat grinder them, or you have things like artillery and napalm and bombs, and you know, you just keep pounding them. So like attack helicopters are not going to be that effective because, you know, like these Cobras are shooting all their toes at these infantry fighting vehicles that are just, you know, way too cheap. So this is the right idea, having some Corsairs come in to drop some napalm. So the only problem is that they're dropping it. Okay. Yeah. So you kind of wanna drop napalm. You wanna typically call in airstrikes as close to your position as possible. So this is what I was talking about earlier, where once you think you've kind of got control of an area, you just start attack moving or fast moving tanks down freeways, and you just see what they find. Especially if they're inexpensive. Even the cheapest tank can still take out a bunch of support vehicles if it finds them. And again, Seahawks, while they're good, these have expensive ATGMs. You know, anything that they kill is going to be not worth the cost of the Seahawk when you're fighting a deck like this. There's nothing particularly, you know, there's nothing that needs a penetration, whatever they are, 20-something ATGMs. So especially like this longbow, and I'm not trying to rag on BlueFor here, but for the audience, in case it's interested for what's happening, why there seems to be so much more red stuff on the map than blue stuff is because the blue stuff is just a lot more expensive and you know, is having to fight stuff like tit for tat, and the ammunition for these helicopters is essentially, you know, costing more than you know, the helicopter, you know, like anything that they're going to kill. So at this point, Red 4, basically, they have this area here. They have the mid. They're pushing across. So they've basically won, as far as I can tell. They have so many troops on the map that just in terms of attrition, you know, basically they can just call in new units, attack with those, and still keep all this stuff here. If I was going to suggest something that BlueFor could have done differently, it'd probably mostly be in deck composition, in that you need cheap infantry in wheeled transports to take the initial points. You really only can use helicopters in very limited situations because of how expensive they made them in Red Dragon compared to A-Land Battle. They're just so expensive, and that there's no way a force of helicopters can get to a point, set down, and then fight off whatever wheeled force is coming down the road. You really have to use them for very small, specialized things. And also, things like these LP, these are fine, but right now they're not fast traveling, so they're on their cross-country speed, which is going to be much slower than their road speed. And they just can't get there in time. Because there's two parts to any, battle in Wargame, is you have to take an area and then you have to be able to hold it against the counterattack. And part of holding it is you have to consider the kind of stuff that's going to come against you. And in order to stop lots of cheap infantry and stuff, you can't really use ATGMs because they're just not cost effective. You need your own tanks, you need your own infantry fighting vehicles with autocannons. You need your own, infantry that can fight them. And so, for example, here's the longbow coming back, but it's these Chinese tanks are they're what, 45 points? I don't know. Well, those are the good ones. These are the ones I'm thinking of, those things, and then so there's also other stuff you kind of have to consider. So this area here is a really good area to have because it sits along this road that goes straight from the Red For spawn to the BlueFor spawn. This area can be good because it can shoot across the road, but only if you put stuff in this town that has a long range. So if you have troops with anti-tank missiles, then yeah, they can shoot all the way down this road and take stuff coming out from a long distance. But having US Marines in here, there's no reason, nothing is going to drive along this road for them to shoot at. Same thing with, for example, I know that, they got blown out of them, but these houses here are not as useful as these houses here. So now we have some tanks coming. These Marines are getting attacked now. Some of these Marines actually aren't even in the houses. In the houses across the street. So when it turns purple, it means that that's close quarters fighting. So they're in the same zone and fighting. And units that have a machine gun, like these Marines do, that says CQC, means they have advantage with some of these Chinese Marines. So again, a Thunderbolt, yeah, I mean, and again, it's so the way that this campaign's structured, you don't always get the best deck against whoever you're playing, but really the thing they needed was cheaper infantry, wheeled vehicles, and more cost-effective air options. So in the end, the points disparity wasn't too crazy, but I think the Red For just had a more effective, more cost-effective deck, and regardless of how well that they did on a tactical level, the units they were using just couldn't compete on a points basis. Well, anyway, thank you for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed that. If you have any questions, let me know. And stay safe, everybody.